The night was supposed to be dazzling. Instead, it was the moment the illusion shattered. At his lavish Bella estate, Charles Boyd, a man who built his empire on polished surfaces, raised a champagne flute to the glittering crowd. His designer suit shimmered under crystal chandeliers, but his eyes, cold as the marble beneath their feet, were fixed on his wife. Tonight, his voice rang out, sharp as broken glass. "My beautiful Melina will do something no one has ever dared. She will give birth right here in our pool to prove that the boy legacy is powerful, natural, and unstoppable." Before she was Melina Moore, the trembling figure standing at the edge of that pool. She had been Melody Moore, the golden voice of America, a young woman from Nashville with fire in her soul and a smile that lit up every stage she stepped on. Her folk pop ballads filled with love, pain, and hope became the soundtrack of a generation. Her concerts sold out arenas within hours. Grammys lined her shelves. She was more than a singer. She was a symbol of authentic, heartfelt strength, but success came at a price. Endless tours, sleepless nights in sterile hotel rooms, and the crushing pressure of fame wore her down. Melina carried it all until one fateful night during a sold-out show at Madison Square Garden. Midway through her most famous ballad, "The World Tilted," the lights blurred into a blinding white and her heart gave out. The collapse was splashed across every headline. Melody Moore faints on stage. Doctors gave her a stark warning. Rest or you will lose more than your voice. You will lose your life. For the first time, Melina stepped away from the spotlight. The world wondered where she had gone. Some claimed she was in rehab. Others whispered she'd had a breakdown. The truth was far simpler and more tragic. She was exhausted, vulnerable, and profoundly alone. That was when Charles Boyd appeared, a Chicago real estate magnate with a charming smile and a portfolio as sharp as his tailored suits. He painted himself as a savior. He promised her peace, a family, and a life away from the suffocating glare of the cameras. "You've given the world enough of your soul, Melody," he'd whispered to her on their third date, his hand covering hers. "Let me give you a place to rest it." To a woman worn down to the bone, his words felt like a warm blanket. Against her manager's warnings, against the faint whisper of her own instincts, Melina said yes to his proposal. In the beginning, Charles kept his promises. He bought her the sprawling Bel Air mansion, a palace of glass and white marble overlooking the city. He whispered sweet words and spoke of the future they would build together. Melina, desperate to believe in a quiet love, thought she had finally found her refuge. She changed her professional name from Melody to Melina, a symbolic shedding of her old skin. She gave up her career, stopped singing, and devoted herself to being the perfect wife. But the fairy tale unraveled quickly. Charles's gentle mask began to slip. He became controlling, his charm curdling into a possessive jealousy of her past fame. He grew angry whenever fans recognized her in public, accusing her of clinging to the spotlight even when she hid from it. "They don't see you, Melina," he would hiss in the car on the way home. "They see Melody Moore, a ghost. I'm the one who's real." Slowly, methodically, he chipped away at her confidence until the vibrant woman in the mirror became a pale, anxious stranger. Then came Isabella Vance, young, ambitious, and ruthless. Isabella entered their lives under the guise of a family friend, the daughter of one of Charles's business associates. Melina, ever gracious, tried to welcome her, but she soon saw the way Charles's eyes followed Isabella's silk-clad figure. The late-night phone calls he claimed were business, the sudden trips he took without her. The betrayal grew so obvious it was suffocating, but Melina stayed for the baby. Pregnant and more vulnerable than ever, Melina told herself she had to endure. She sang lullabibs to her unborn child in secret, clutching her belly with tears streaming down her face. She prayed the child would bring peace back into their home, that Charles would soften. Instead, his cruelty only deepened. Behind closed doors, he called her weak, mocking her for gaining weight. "You used to be a star," he'd sneer. "Now you're just a vessel." Isabella, always present with a sly smirk, would add her own poison. "You used to be someone, Melina. Now you're just a mother." Melina swallowed her pain, forcing a smile in public, hiding her bruised spirit behind designer gowns. The world that once adored her no longer knew her name. She was forgotten, erased, until tonight. This hideous, glittering party where her private nightmare was being thrust into the spotlight once more. Charles's hand gripped her shoulder like iron, his fingers digging into her skin. The music had stopped. All that remained was the sound of water lapping gently against the pool's edge and the collective gasp of the crowd. Staff moved with chilling efficiency. Towels, cameras, lights, all prepared. Every detail had been planned except for the most important one, her safety. "Charles, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not this, not tonight." Her plea was drowned in the wave of murmurs rising from the guests. He leaned in, his breath cold against her ear, his words meant only for her. "Smile, my love. You're about to make me the most talked about man in Los Angeles." And as he propelled her forward, Melina realized the world would soon remember her name again. Not for her music, but for her suffering. Charles Boyd was the kind of man who knew how to play a role. To outsiders, he was dazzling. He'd built a real estate empire from the ground up, transforming Chicago's skyline before setting his sights on the grand prize. Los Angeles. He spoke of ambition, of creating a legacy, of providing his wife with a life fit for royalty. People believed him. They always did. His handshake was firm, his smile disarming, and his confidence was a fortress. But behind the polished surface was a man consumed by a ravenous, gnawing greed that had its roots in the rust-pocked streets of Gary, Indiana. Charles wasn't born into wealth. He was born into the shadow of shuttered steel mills and broken dreams. He'd watched his father, a proud but beaten man, work himself into an early grave for a company that forgot his name the day he died. From that bitterness, Charles forged his life's mission. He would never be powerless. He would never be forgotten. He would climb so high that the world would have no choice but to look up at him in awe. Every relationship, every partnership, every smile he offered had a price. He didn't build his empire with brilliance alone. He built it by clawing his way up, using anyone necessary to secure his place at the top. He saw people not as human beings but as assets or liabilities, and Melina Moore, the beloved Melody Moore, was the perfect asset. When he married her, Charles saw not a wife, but a brand. The world knew her as a star, a symbol of grace and talent. Her face opened doors he could never dream of touching. Marrying her wasn't an act of love. It was the ultimate acquisition. Her silence, her retirement, her retreat from fame. Those were his victories. He had tamed the golden voice of America and locked it away in a gilded cage. That was his power. In public, he paraded Melina like a prized possession, his hand always possessively on her back, a practiced smile on his lips. Behind closed doors, he was a different man. He was ruthless, his words honed into weapons. If she questioned him, he reminded her that without him she was nothing but a washed-up singer with a weak heart. Each jab cut deeper until Melina's once bright spirit grew quieter, her vibrant eyes dimming. The pregnancy only emboldened him. To Charles, their child was another tool. He planned photos, interviews, and lavish events, all centered around the marketing concept of the perfect Boyd family. He spoke about legacy, not love. He saw the baby as another way to polish his brand and elevate his status among the LA elite, the old money families who still looked down on the boy from Indiana. And then came Isabella Vance. Where Melina was gentle, Isabella was sharp. Where Melina sacrificed, Isabella demanded. Charles adored that ruthlessness. In Isabella, he saw a reflection of his own insatiable hunger. She didn't challenge his ego, she fueled it. She encouraged his cruelest schemes, whispering ideas of grandeur into his ear while laughing at Melina's quiet pain. Together, they crafted the grotesque spectacle of the underwater birth. It was Isabella's idea, born during a late-night rendezvous in his downtown penthouse. "Think about it, Charles," she had purred, tracing the line of his jaw. "It's audacious, it's powerful. It shows you're a man who controls everything, even the very act of creation. No one in your circle would dare. They'll all envy you, They'll all bow to you. His ego swelled under her encouragement. The plan was simple and monstrous. Melina would deliver the baby in front of powerful investors and media figures, proving she was the perfect, obedient wife who would do anything for her visionary husband. The story would go viral worldwide. Charles Boyd, the man whose family embodies strength and defies convention. Any sign of Melina's weakness, her pain, or her fear would be buried under his carefully orchestrated image. He rehearsed his speech, planned the lighting, even chose the vintage of champagne for the celebratory toast. Every detail was precise because Charles believed perfection was the only way to keep the ghosts of Gary, Indiana, at bay. The only problem was Melina herself. She wasn't breaking fast enough. Somewhere deep inside her, the old melody, the woman of fire and conviction, still breathed. He could feel it in her moments of quiet defiance, in the sad lullabies she hummed to her belly, and Charles couldn't allow that. He needed to extinguish that final spark. Tonight, as he stood by the pool, Charles wasn't thinking about his wife or his unborn child. He was thinking about cameras, headlines, and power. Melina was no longer a woman in his eyes. She was a stage prop. And as he gave the signal for her to step into the freezing water, Charles never realized that the show he had designed to immortalize his power would soon become his greatest humiliation. The mansion's ballroom shimmered with gold, silver, and glass. It was the kind of place where power gathered, where men in expensive suits talked about deals worth millions, and women compared diamonds the size of raindrops. Laughter echoed against the marble walls. For most of the guests, it was just another night of indulgence. For Melina Moore, it was a cage built to humiliate her. Everywhere she turned, eyes followed. Once those eyes had belonged to fans who adored her. Tonight they belonged to strangers, curious, cold, waiting to see what kind of spectacle her husband would create. Melina could feel their stares cutting into her skin, dissecting her like a rare specimen. Her hands trembled against her swollen belly. The baby kicked as though warning her of the storm about to break. David thrived on the attention. Standing tall near the grand pool that glittered under the chandelier lights, he lifted his champagne glass. "Tonight," he declared, his voice booming with the confidence of a king, "my wife will bring life into this world in a way no one has ever seen. A symbol of purity, of strength, of our legacy." The crowd erupted in applause, though some gasps betrayed their shock. Melina's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to beg someone, anyone, to stop this madness. But her voice was locked inside her chest. She could already hear Charles's cruel whisper in her mind. "Smile. Do as I say. Don't embarrass me." Isabella floated through the crowd like a glittering phantom, every step calculated. She wrapped her arm around Charles's and laughed, her voice carrying above the music. When Melina's face turned pale at the announcement, Isabella stepped in with practiced sweetness. She placed a hand over Melina's trembling ones. "Don't be afraid, darling," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'll be magnificent. Everyone will admire you." To the crowd, she was comforting. To Melina, the words were a blade twisted deeper. A hush fell over the guests as Melina was guided toward the pool's edge. The lights reflected off the water, casting ghostly ripples on her pale face. She gripped her belly tightly, whispering under her breath, "Please not like this." No one answered. The silence was suffocating. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Is this safe?" Another whispered, "It's cruel." But no one dared raise their voice. No one dared defy Charles Boyd. Power and fear kept their lips sealed. And then, just as a staff member reached out to help her step down into the water, Melina saw it. Blood. It rushed from her nose, a sudden shocking warmth dripping onto her trembling hands. The first drop silenced the ballroom for a brief frozen second. No one moved. The crimson stain spread across her hands, gleaming under the lights like a warning. Her body swayed. Instead of concern, Charles's face hardened. "Stand straight." He hissed through clenched teeth, his smile still plastered on for the cameras. "Don't ruin this moment." Melina's legs quivered. She tried to steady herself, but her vision blurred. The crowd whispered louder now, their curiosity mixing with unease. Isabella was the first to break the silence. She let out a light laugh. "Don't be so nervous, darling," she said loudly, her sweet voice dripping with venom. "Every woman bleeds a little when she's about to give birth. It's natural." Her words cut through the crowd, framing Melina's suffering as weakness, as if she were failing at her one purpose. Melina's body doubled over with a sudden, sharp contraction, a surge of agony that shot through her like fire. The guests gasped, stepping back as if her pain might be contagious. Charles seized her arm roughly, forcing her upright. "You will not embarrass me," he muttered under his breath, his grip like iron. Tears welled in Melina's eyes. She looked out into the sea of strangers, silently begging for help. But all she saw were curious stares, phones raised, cameras flashing. Not one hand reached for her. Her knees buckled again, and this time she collapsed against the marble tiles, the sound echoing through the grand hall. David crouched beside her, still smiling at the crowd. "She's fine," he assured them. "Just nerves," but Melina knew she wasn't fine. Her body shook violently as another contraction ripped through her. Isabella leaned down, her face inches from Melina's, her eyes sparkling with triumph. "Look at you," she whispered. "The world's forgotten star, crawling on the floor like a broken doll. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe you don't deserve to shine anymore." Those words pierced Melina deeper than the pain tearing through her body. Darkness crowded the edges of her vision, and as her head struck the floor, the crowd erupted into chaos. Charles's perfect smile finally stiffened. To the cameras, he looked like a devoted husband, but his whispered words were merciless. "Get up, Melina. You are not going to ruin this for me. You will go into that water." Now he signaled to two of his security men. They stepped forward without expression, each grabbing one of her arms and dragging her toward the shimmering pool. Melina's bare feet scraped against the marble, leaving streaks of blood behind her. She thrashed weakly, begging, "No, please, I'll die." But her cries were drowned in the buzz of whispers and the snapping of camera flashes. The men lifted her and lowered her into the freezing water. That icy shock of the water was a brutal awakening. Melina's body convulsed instantly, her breath ripped from her lungs in a silent scream. The water closed around her like a coffin, the cold piercing her skin, stabbing her muscles and stealing the last of her strength. Her white gown, now stained with blood, floated around her like a ghostly shroud. The blood bloomed in the pristine water like crimson smoke. She struggled to keep her head above the surface, but another contraction, violent and unforgiving, tore through her. The scream that escaped her lips only sent more water rushing into her mouth. She coughed, choked, thrashed. Her arms flailed toward the crowd, a desperate, primal plea for help, but no one moved. No one reached for her. Some watched with horrified fascination, their phones held high to capture the unfolding tragedy. Others, with a morbid delight, saw it as the ultimate reality show. Charles stood tall at the pool's edge, his smile tight but unbroken, as though he were the unflappable host of a flawless show. Isabella leaned against him, whispering something that made him smirk. They were gods on their Olympus, watching a mortal suffer for their entertainment. Melina's vision blurred, the magnificent chandeliers fractured into a million splintered lights on the water's surface. She could feel her baby's faint heartbeat inside her own, a fragile, desperate drum against the encroaching darkness. With the last of her breath, she prayed, not for herself, but for the child she carried. Her body weakened. Her limbs felt heavy as lead. Her chest burned. Darkness closed in around her. She sank lower, her hands reaching up one last time through the water, bubbles escaping her lips in a final silent cry. She thought it was the end. Then, suddenly, the surface of the water exploded. A tall figure, a shadow in a dark suit, dove into the pool without a moment's hesitation, cutting through the freezing water with powerful, urgent strokes. Strong arms wrapped around Melina's trembling body, pulling her up toward the air, toward life. Her head broke the surface, and she coughed violently, her lungs screaming as they took in a ragged breath. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Phones flashed like a lightning storm. Guests pushed forward, craning their necks to see who had dared to interrupt Charles Boyd's spectacle. And then they saw him, Julian Croft. He was no ordinary man in their world of luxury. Julian wasn't just wealthy, he was legendary. A reclusive tech billionaire from Silicon Valley. He had built his empire with steel determination and a vision that saw the future before anyone else. Rumors always followed him. The ruthless dealmaker, the untouchable tycoon who had dismantled corporate giants with a single phone call. He rarely appeared at social events, and his presence tonight was a coup for Charles, who had courted him for an investment. Yet in this moment, Julian wasn't a business titan. He was a savior. Lifting Melina into his arms, he dripping wet and shivering, he carried her to the edge of the pool as if she weighed nothing. Water streamed from her gown, stray with her blood. Her head lolled weakly against his chest, her lips pale, her breaths shallow and erratic. For the first time that evening, a true profound silence fell over the room. The performance was over. Reality had crashed the party. Charles's face, a mask of curated charm just moments before, twisted into a mask of raw, unfiltered rage. "What do you think you're doing, Croft?" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "This is a private family matter." Julian's dark eyes, sharp enough to cut steel, locked onto him. His voice was calm, but held the thunderous weight of his authority. "I'm saving her life," he said, the words slicing through the air, "something you clearly have no interest in." The words ignited murmurs among the guests. Some nodded in agreement, emboldened by Julian's defiance. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to take sides, but unable to ignore the truth. Isabella, rattled but quick to recover, stepped forward with her saccharine smile. "Julian, this is all a misunderstanding. Melina is just overwhelmed." Charles was only trying to. Julian silenced her with a look so piercing that she faltered mid-sentence. He turned his attention back to Melina, his hand gently brushing the damp hair from her face. "You're safe now," he whispered. His voice meant only for her. Melina's eyelids fluttered. She caught a glimpse of his face. The strong jaw, the furrowed brow, the fierce protectiveness in his eyes. Something deep inside her stirred. A flicker of recognition. She remembered that face from years ago in the front row at her concerts, a serious young man watching her with an intensity that stood out even in a sea of adoring fans. But before she could grasp the memory, another wave of pain ripped through her body. She cried out, clutching her belly as blood continued to seep from her. Julian's expression darkened. He lifted his head and barked to the stunned crowd, his voice a command that no one could ignore. "Call an ambulance now." No one moved at first, paralyzed by the shock of defying Charles Boyd, but Julian Croft's authority was absolute. Within seconds, someone dialed 911. Others rushed for towels and blankets. For the first time that night, Melina felt the weight of human compassion return to the room. But Charles wasn't finished. His pride was shredded, his grand plan ruined. Stepping closer, his voice lowered to a dangerous growl. "She's still my wife. You have no right to touch her." And as Charles reached for Melina, Julian rose to his full height, placing himself between them, the room bracing for the inevitable clash. Julian Croft rose from the poolside, water dripping from his 1000 suit, Melina still cradled protectively in his arms. He stood tall, his presence commanding, his glare fixed on Charles Boyd. For a moment the lavish ballroom felt like a battlefield. Guests froze, unsure whether they were about to witness a rescue or a war. Charles stepped forward, his smile gone, his mask of civility shattered. Fury twisted his handsome features into something monstrous. "She's my wife," he spat, pointing at Melina as if she were property. "You have no right to interfere." Julian didn't flinch. His voice was steady, resonant, carrying across the stunned crowd. A husband protects his wife. He doesn't drag her bleeding into a freezing pool to show off like a circus act. You forfeited every right the moment you treated her like an object. The room gasped. No one had ever spoken to Charles Boyd like this. Not in public, not in front of his circle of power. Even Isabella's perfect smile faltered. She reached for Charles's arm, whispering, "Calm down. They're all watching." But Charles's pride was wounded beyond repair. His empire had been built on control, on intimidation, and now Julian Croft was dismantling it with words as sharp as blades. "You think you can embarrass me in my own house?" Charles snarled. "Do you know who I am?" Julian took one step closer, his frame towering, his aura radiating unshackable power. "Yes," he said evenly. "You're the man who almost killed his own wife and child for applause." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some guests lowered their eyes, ashamed for having clapped earlier. Others pulled out their phones, the red lights of recording devices winking in the dimness. They sensed the scandal that would soon flood headlines. For the first time, Charles realized he was losing the audience. His reputation, his image, his carefully built illusion. It was crumbling. Melina stirred weakly in Julian's arms, her lips parting. "Please stop," she whispered. But her plea only fueled Charles's rage. "Don't you dare side with him," he snapped at her. "You're mine, Melina. You will always be mine." Julian's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a growl. "No, she doesn't belong to you. She belongs to herself, and she deserves better than this." That was the moment the shift happened. The guests were no longer passive observers. For years, many had whispered doubts about Charles's cruelty, but none had dared to speak out. Now, with Julian standing as living proof of courage, they saw the truth laid bare. Isabella's mask cracked too. She clutched Charles's arm tighter, her eyes darting nervously. If Charles fell tonight, her glittering dream of power collapsed with him. "Charles," she hissed under her breath, "control yourself." But he had lost control entirely. His face burned red, veins bulging in his neck. He lunged forward, grabbing for Melina, his hand clawing at her wrist. Julian pivoted swiftly, shifting Melina to one arm while blocking Charles's advance with the other. The force of their collision echoed across the marble. Glasses shattered on nearby tables as startled guests leaped back. For a second the two men locked eyes, Charles's blazing with desperation, Julian's burning with unshakable resolve. And in that tense silence, before anyone could breathe, Charles drew back his fist, ready to strike, not realizing the cameras were capturing every second of his downfall. The ballroom froze as his fist hung in the air, trembling with rage. Michael shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. In one swift, fluid movement, he caught Charles's wrist just before the blow could land. The clash of strength reverberated through the silence. "She's mine," Charles roared, spit flying from his lips, his voice cracked, not with love, but with the desperation of ownership. "You can't take her from me." Julian's eyes blazed. "You already lost her," he said, his voice ringing like a verdict. "The moment you chose your pride over her life, Isabella, realizing disaster was unfolding, tried to intervene. "Everyone, please," she said, her voice wavering. "This is just a misunderstanding. Charles is under a lot of stress." Her words were drowned out by the sound of Melina coughing violently. Blood trickled from her lips. The sight silenced the room more effectively than any speech. The horror on the guests' faces grew as her condition worsened before their eyes. Julian's protective instinct surged. He turned toward the exit. She needs a hospital now. Several guests finally broke free from their fear. Someone shouted that the ambulance was on its way. Others cleared a path. But Charles wasn't done. He lunged again, his eyes wild. "Don't you dare walk out with her. She stays with me." Julian spun around, his glare like fire. Then he spoke, his voice low, dangerous, and final. "Touch her again, and I will end you." The crowd erupted. "Call security," someone yelled. "Get him away from her." The tide had turned completely. Where once Charles commanded respect, now he inspired only fear and disgust. As the wail of sirens grew louder outside, flashing red and blue lights reflecting against the tall windows, everyone knew this night would mark the beginning of Charles Boyd's ruin. Just as the paramedics burst through the doors, Charles broke free and lunged one last time, not at Julian, but directly at Melina. The ambulance tore through the streets of Los Angeles, its sirens wailing against the night. Inside, Melina lay strapped to a stretcher, her body shaking uncontrollably, the oxygen mask fogged with every desperate, ragged breath. Paramedics worked swiftly, their voices sharp and urgent. She's losing too much blood. BP is dropping fast. Beside her, Julian Croft sat rigid, his large hand gripping hers with unyielding strength. His expensive suit was soaked, but he didn't care. His world had narrowed to the fragile woman before him. He leaned closer, his voice breaking through the chaos. "Stay with me, Melina. Please, you're stronger than this." Her eyelids fluttered. In her fading consciousness, she saw fragments of her life. The bright lights on stage, the roar of fans, the cruelty of betrayal, and now the warmth of a man who held her not as a trophy, but as something precious. Her lips moved faintly under the mask. "The baby, please save the baby." Julian's chest tightened, his throat aching with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "We'll save you both," he vowed. "I promise." The ambulance jolted to a stop at Cedar Sinai Medical Center. The doors flung open and the stretcher was wheeled out with urgency. Inside the emergency room, doctors and nurses swarmed around Melina. "She's hemorrhaging. Prep for surgery now." The air filled with the sound of beeping monitors and frantic calls. Julian stood at the edge of the chaos, his fists clenched, feeling utterly helpless for the first time in his life. He was a man used to control, to bending the world to his will. But here he could only watch as Melina's life hung by a thread. A surgeon turned to him briefly, his face grim. "Sir, we need to operate immediately. She's critical in the baby. It's too early to tell." The word struck Julian like a hammer. He stepped closer to Melina as they wheeled her away, bending down to whisper in her ear, "Fight, Melina. Fight for yourself. Fight for your child. Don't let him take anything else from you." Her hand twitched weakly in his. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Then the monitors shrieked a piercing alarm. Her body convulsed. Her pulse was crashing. "We're losing her," a doctor shouted. The emergency room doors slammed shut, leaving Julian staring at his own reflection in the narrow glass window. Inside the operating room was a scene of controlled frenzy. "Bep is crashing. Start transfusion now." The lead surgeon, Dr. Aris Thorne, barked. His gloved hands moved with swift precision. "She's hemorrhaging badly from a placental abruption, likely caused by the stress and trauma. We need to stop the bleeding, or we lose her." Melina's body, pale and still under the harsh lights, jolted as they used the paddles to restart her heart. The monitor steadied briefly, only to falter again. Dr. Thorne's jaw was tight. "She's not stabilizing. Prepare for an emergency C-section. We need to get the baby out now if we have any chance of saving either of them." The air thickened with urgency. Two lives now balanced on a knife's edge. Outside, Julian pressed his forehead against the cool glass, whispering like a prayer. "Hold on, please hold on." Inside the haze of unconsciousness, Melina dreamed. She stood on a dark stage, the silence where a roar of applause should have been. A door opened in the distance, beckoning her toward a peaceful, empty darkness. But then another voice broke through. Julian's, steady and warm. "Fight, Melina. Fight for your child." She clutched her belly in the vision, feeling the faint kick of her unborn baby. A fragile life still fighting. With a surge of will, she turned away from the darkness. On the operating table, her body responded. The monitor beeped with a stronger rhythm. "We've got a pulse." A nurse cried, but the fight wasn't over. Dr. Thorne worked quickly. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, a tiny, fragile form was lifted from Melina, but there was no cry, only a devastating silence. A pediatric team rushed the baby to a side station, their movements frantic, no pulse, starting compressions. The room held its breath, the gentle rhythmic pressure on the tiny chest, the hiss of the oxygen pump. Those were the only sounds. Julian, straining to see through the glass, saw a nurse shake her head, tears in her eyes. His heart shattered after what felt like an eternity. The pediatric chief looked at the clock, his face etched with grief. "Time of death?" The surgeon's voice cracked slightly as he turned back to his team. "Focus on saving the mother. We can't lose her, too." And as the machines wailed again, Melina's body went limp. She was still bleeding, her life draining away. Dr. Thorne looked at his team, his eyes filled with a grim determination. The battle for Melina's life raged on, a desperate, bloody war against the darkness that threatened to consume her. While Melina fought for her life, Charles Boyd was escorted into a sterile holding room at a downtown APD station. His once perfect suit was torn, his tie hung loose, his hair matted with sweat and pool water. The world he had meticulously built was gone. Now his empire had shrunk to 4 grey walls and a metal table. He slammed his fists on the table, veins bulging in his neck. "This is a mistake," he bellowed to the empty room. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Charles Boyd." But no one came to listen. His phone had been confiscated. But even if he had it, the calls wouldn't have saved him. The headlines were already spreading across every news outlet like a virus. Real estate tycoon Charles Boyd forces pregnant wife into near-death spectacle. Clips from the party flooded social media. His cold commands, his violent outbursts, and Julian Croft's heroic rescue. The world that once praised him now spat his name with disgust. Investors began pulling out. Contracts collapsed. Lawsuits piled up at his door. Every bridge he had built with charm and manipulation burned in an instant. And worst of all, Isabella Vance had vanished. The woman who had whispered poison into his ear was gone. By morning, she had issued a statement to the press, her lawyers painting her as an innocent bystander, horrified by Charles's actions. "I was only there to support my dear friend Melina." The statement read, "I never knew Charles was capable of such cruelty." When a guard showed him the article, Charles threw his chair against the wall. "Liar!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. Sophia had abandoned the sinking ship, erasing any connection to his downfall. Meanwhile, Melina's image was rising from the ashes. Photos of Julian carrying her from the pool went viral, captioned with words of sympathy and outrage. Justice for Melina trended worldwide. The world that had forgotten her was now rallying behind her. Charles sat in the interrogation room, his world collapsing. He clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing with a venomous resolve. "This isn't over," he muttered. "She thinks she can run to him. She thinks she can rise again. No, I'll destroy them both. If I go down, I'm taking them with me." Hours later, in a quiet recovery room at Cedar Sinai, Melina stirred. Machines beeped softly beside her bed. She was pale, her body frail, but alive. Julian sat at her side, refusing to leave. He had been there since she came out of surgery, a silent, unwavering vigil. Her lashes fluttered, her lips parted. Where am I?" she whispered. Julian leaned closer, his voice soft but steady. "You're safe, Melina. You're in the hospital. They saved you." Her eyes searched his face, struggling to piece together the memories. Slowly, it returned. The pool, the blood, the icy water, the pain. Fear flashed in her gaze. Her hand shot to her flat belly, trembling. "The baby?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. "Where's my baby?" Julian's throat tightened. He had faced down corporate raiders and hostile governments without flinching. But this moment broke him. His voice cracked as he spoke the hardest words of his life. "Melina, I'm so sorry. The doctors, they couldn't save her." Her eyes widened, a universe of pain exploding within them. A sound tore from her throat, a raw, piercing cry of a mother's grief that shattered the quiet of the room. "No," she sobbed, clutching her stomach as if holding on to the emptiness. "No, please. No, I carried her. I sang to her. She can't be gone." Julian's own eyes burned. He reached for her, pulling her gently against his chest despite the wires and tubes. "I know, Melina," he whispered, his own grief a heavy weight in his chest. "I know you didn't deserve any of this, but you're alive, you're still here, and I swear on my life, I will not let anyone hurt you ever again." Her sobs shook through him, heavy and endless. She buried her face against him, her tears soaking his shirt. For the first time in years, Melina Moore, the woman once adored by millions, was allowed to grieve. Not as a star, not as a wife, but as a broken mother. And in that moment of shared sorrow, a bond was forged between them. A quiet promise made in the shadow of an unbearable loss. A few weeks later, Charles Boyd walked out of the courthouse, out on bail. Money and powerful lawyers had worked their dark magic, reducing the charges, twisting the narrative into a story of a man under extreme emotional distress. His smile for the cameras was forced, but his eyes held a chilling, unrepentant fire. He was not broken. He was dangerous. Julian had moved Melina from the hospital to a secure, private medical facility he owned in the tranquil hills of Malibu. The place was a fortress. But Melina's fear remained. "He won't stop, Julian," she whispered one evening, her hand trembling in his. "I know him. He can't accept losing? Then let him come," Julian replied, his voice a low growl. "This time he won't be facing a frightened woman alone. He'll be facing me." His words were prophetic. Late one night, Charles made his final desperate move. He sent 2 hired men to breach the facility security. Their orders clear: finish the job. But Julian was prepared. The attack was swift, brutal, and short-lived. Julian's security team, comprised of former Special Forces operatives, neutralized the intruders before they could even reach Melina's wing. The failed hit was the final nail in Charles's coffin. Caught on camera directing the attack via a recorded call, he was arrested again, his bail revoked. This time there would be no escape. The story then jumps forward 1 year. The trial was a media sensation. Charles Boyd, stripped of his power and polish, was sentenced to life in prison. His empire was seized and dismantled. Isabella Vance vanished into obscurity, a disgraced footnote in a story of ruin. Melina never attended the trial. She was in Carmel by the sea, living in a quiet, elegant home overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The crashing waves were a constant soothing rhythm against the shore of her healing. The grief for her lost daughter, whom she had named Hope, was a permanent part of her, a quiet ache in her soul, but it no longer defined her. With Julian's steady, patient support, she had found her way back to herself. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply created a space where she could be safe enough to fall apart and then slowly piece herself back together. She was in therapy. She walked on the beach for hours. And for the first time in years, she began to write music again. Her new songs weren't the bright, hopeful ballads of Melody Moore. They were deeper, richer, filled with the raw ache of loss, but also the fierce light of survival. Julian found her one afternoon, sitting at the piano, a melody filling the house. He stood in the doorway, listening as she sang, her voice no longer just golden, but forged in fire. It was stronger, more authentic than it had ever been. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. That evening, a local charity for abused women was holding a fundraising gala. Julian was a major donor. He had asked Melina gently if she would consider attending. He never expected what she said next. "I'll go," she said, her voice clear, "and I want to sing." Standing on that small stage in front of a few hundred people, Melina felt a familiar tremor of stage fright. But this time it was different. She looked out and saw not a sea of demanding fans, but a room of empathetic faces. She saw Julian in the front row, his eyes filled with a love so profound it gave her strength. She took a breath and began to sing. It was a new song, a lullaby for the daughter she never got to hold. A ballad of breaking and becoming whole again. Her voice soared, filled with every ounce of her pain, her resilience, her hope. The performance wasn't for fame or for applause. It was for herself. It was a declaration that she had survived, that she was free. When the last note faded, the room was silent for a moment, then erupted in heartfelt applause. Julian was on his feet, his face a mask of pride and love. Melina smiled, a true radiant smile that reached her eyes. The nightmare was over, and a new life, bright, unbreakable, and finally her own, had just begun. Melina Moore's story is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She was pushed into the darkest waters of betrayal and cruelty, but she refused to drown. Instead, she found the strength to surface, to breathe, and to reclaim her own voice. Her journey reminds us that no matter how deep the darkness, the dawn will always come. And true power isn't about controlling others. It's about owning your own survival. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. If this story of turning scars into strength moved you, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs a message of hope today. And don't forget to subscribe, because together we can prove that every voice deserves to be heard.